Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ruth Dunwoody, and I'm from the Clinical Education Unit at the School of Health and Rehab Sciences at the University of Queensland. Welcome to our webinar this afternoon on feedback for learners. I've got a couple of housekeeping things just before we start. So we're using the Zoom platform today, and you should be able to have some functions which allow you to chat, which is the little bubble symbol. And if you do send me like a little message, then I can receive that and hopefully respond to that in a timely manner. We are planning to run the webinar. It's timetabled for an hour. The presentation itself goes for about 50 minutes. And I'm aiming to take some questions at the end. So if you think of a question throughout, you're very welcome to use the chat function to send me a question. And then at the end, I'll have a bit of a look over some of those questions and try and respond. If we do end up running out of time, if you would like to identify yourself in that question, then I'll be able to get back to you with a more full response. Okay, so to start off with, I'm going to just use the poll function on the webinar. So I've got a little starter poll just to test this out, and I'll finish off with a short evaluation at the end of the presentation with 4 or 5 questions. So if you could please hang around and to answer those questions, that would be very beneficial. But the first poll is just to establish your experience with students. You should be able to see now. Just select one of these responses. We'll go for just a little bit longer. Seconds or so, and then we'll end that polling and continue on. Okay, thank you. Stop that now so you can no longer let me know whether or not you've had any experience with students. All right. So if no, I can't see any. I just want to let you know that I can't see any of you, but you can hopefully see me and the slideshow. If that's not the case, if somebody could just type and say, no, that's not the case, and I'll try and troubleshoot at this end. Otherwise, I'm proceeding on this on the assumption that you can see the slides and that you can see and hear me clearly. Okay. So our first slide just identifies some of the aims of today. It's important just to go over these very briefly. We'd like to look at feedback for learning with respect to the learning process, looking at providing the influences on providing effective feedback so that promotes a better outcome for our learners. Also want to look at some of the elements that underpin the provision of quality feedback. Yeah, I'll unpack that a little bit more as we go on. And finally finish off with some strategies for consideration when dealing with challenging feedback. So this presentation covers 4 key themes. Importance for learning and feedback in the learning process, factors that contribute to quality feedback, providing effective feedback for learners, and delivering challenging feedback. The first of which is the learning process. So there's much written in literature about the process of feedback and its importance and everything. So if we were to draw on this to understand why it's such an integral component of the learning process, that helps us understand the range of outcomes that can result from providing quality feedback and allows us to adjust accordingly. So if we consider that feedback itself, if we think about it as a comparison, a performance that we see is a comparison from what is actual to what is desired. And the mechanism of feedback allows us to compare the two. We know that when feedback is effective, that deeper learning occurs. And that's generally because there's the opportunity to unpack and to delve into the reasons why somebody is performing the way they are. And the depth of understanding is therefore greater with a conversation with them. We also know that feedback supports the learning relationship. So, you know, and I'm going to go on and talk a little bit more about that as a dynamic process later. But in terms of the learning relationship itself, it's very important to have a conversation around needs and gaps in performance. Other authors have described feedback as being very powerful, and particularly the influence that it has on learning. It can be, it can have a negative influence or it can have a positive influence, and so the delivery and the effectiveness is what determines the powerfulness of that feedback. And then there's a whole school of literature that supports feedback in the domain of assessment. So if we look at feedback as being formative assessment, we can use that to guide better outcomes and help students to progress towards those learning outcomes. Generally, as we understand, assessment drives learning, and so you know that this is a great motivator for students to change if we use and capture feedback within online assessment. And many of you would be used to doing that if you've had students before in practice and you've been involved in the assessment process. So in looking at the literature as well, we have identified that there's sort of three main themes that emerge. This feedback is information, where the focus on the feedback is about content. So providing someone with some information about what they need to do or what they're doing. Then there's feedback on as action, where the focus is on the interaction with the information. So what do you need to do to get better? So provide you with the information, and now I'm going to let you know what it is that you need to do. If you look at a little bit more of a third theme, which is a little bit more dynamic, it looks at feedback as cycle. And so the information here is, or the emphasis here is on the interaction that occurs between the information received, how that learner responds, and ultimately how they improve their performance. So it becomes much more of a cyclical, dynamic process rather than a linear interaction. This is also, this model I've adapted, so I have to say that up front, that this is, when you refer to this article, the model that was presented here, it doesn't look like the model in the article. However, key elements of that model have been incorporated into this. If we continue with the dynamic kind of feedback model, and feedback is a dynamic process, we can look at this particular model that has been presented as a student-centered approach. So it clearly puts the student at the center of the feedback process. This emphasizes that the learner is going to influence their own outcomes, and that's particularly important when we are interacting with that student. All too often, the models in the past that we've looked at have been very educator focused, but it's really about how does the educator give feedback? What does the educator need to do? How do you construct feedback such that the learner understands? And whilst those elements still have a role in the overall process of feedback, this model flips it a little bit, puts it on its head, and emphasises the learner at the centre and the things that the learner needs to do to optimise the feedback that they are getting from a number of sources. I like this model because it looks at the complexities that exist within clinical placements and the contextual environments that are within that. it's probably a difficult thing for educators to remind the learner that it really is up to them what they do and how they interact with the feedback and the contextual information that's on offer. And so, you know, that is something that I would encourage you just to come back to, perhaps read this article, have a think about the elements within this model, so that really at the crux of how we interact with our students can anchor a little bit more in these principles. What this group of authors suggest is that there are multiple influences on the feedback that is provided. So the students need to take in information from the context in which they're in. They also need to look at the supervision that's provided, and the supervisor rather brings to the context their knowledge, their expertise, their experience with students, and their understanding of the learning objectives. So all of those things are impacting on the learner as they move through their placement, arriving at the learning outcomes that are expected of them. This group of authors suggests that the model works well when the learner is receptive, so they're ready, firstly, to receive feedback. They listen. They have values that affect their learning, so they value the learning process, and that in terms of their self-efficacy, they have the beliefs to motivate themselves and change their behaviours within this learning process. So those are the elements that really affect whether or not the student or the learner is receptive. Then there's the necessary skills in responsiveness. So we would often say that we would like our students to be active in that process. What that means is that we expect the student or the learner to seek feedback, recognise their own progress, monitor their own progress, and moving on to their reflective components, be able to have some insight as to where they are now and what they might need to do for the future, so that they can have skills that allow them to think about the processes involved in changing their own performance. So what we're describing here is what we would hope in many of our learners, but I certainly acknowledge that the learner might be on a varied continuum. This is quite a mature learning approach to clinical practice, but certainly one where clinical educators have a role in facilitating. And this is part of the learning expected here in the webinar, is that we are able to reflect on the student learning experience in a different way, such that we can influence or change behaviour within the learner. So moving from further down the model, it's important that we understand that the top three components of being receptive, responsive and reflective take a bit of time. The students need to sit with that, understand that, perhaps discuss it further with you. They need to engage in what we talked about before, in that learning exchange, the interaction, the dynamic part of the model. Conversation, intentional interaction occurs, and that leads to improved learning outcomes. So these are all major considerations when looking at our approach to providing feedback. It's easy for us to just tell a student what they need to do, and that is a more linear process. And at times that might be what's warranted. So the context might dictate that that's exactly the response that you give. For a more deeper experience and and navigating the complexities in developing skill sets, there is more involved. So it's not just a simple instruction, and would urge you to consider these key elements within this model before engaging, or particularly when the learner is not progressing as well as you might anticipate. If we now move on to one of the second domains of this presentation, which focuses on the contributors to quality feedback. So this, an extension of this model and the paper written by these authors looks at quality as being influenced by the learner, by the context, and by the educator themselves. So again, it's really looking at that interactional interplay in all of those elements. And I've introduced some of those concepts already. The learner, their understanding, their receptiveness, their readiness, and the level at which they're at. So I don't think I talked about that so much. It's more the stage of learning for that learner. Now, in many of our placements, learners might come into our supervision experiences as perhaps third years or perhaps final year students for a period of time, perhaps sessional, perhaps 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 10 weeks. Throughout those different time periods, the level of the learner will vary. And so starting out, the feedback and the approach is clearly different to towards the end, where there is much more emphasis placed on attainment of the learning outcomes. The quality is influenced by the educator themselves. Their interpersonal skills are a huge part of the learning relationship and the qualities that we know work within a learning environment. So where the educator is approachable, is open, can describe, translate, support, facilitate these types of skills, they are very important in the whole process of providing feedback. The educator's values themselves might contribute to the feedback. They might skew feedback and emphasise different elements of practice that may not be shared with another person, or may not, yes, so a learner may not yet have developed some values that are born out of experience. And so it would be important to recognise those in yourself if you feel that perhaps you're emphasising a little bit more value of your own personal values in the feedback process. As always, as human beings, we have biases. To manage biases is, again, can be quite a difficult thing, but it's an important thing where we don't unnecessarily emphasise one skill set over another skill set. These biases can come up when we have maybe a friendly relationship, a good relationship with the student, because they might think the same way as we do, or we get along easily, or it's not a difficult interaction. We might overemphasise that as being someone who fits in really well, and therefore they have knowledge and understanding of what's going on. Until you stretch below the surface a little bit and you actually provide a lens that looks at the task at hand and the learning outcome that needs to be achieved and the skill set of that student, the student might be very skilled at covering up some of those fundamental skills underneath. So we just need to work on things like that might be our biases, or it might be something that happens early on in placement, and you anchor to that, and towards the end of the placement you still find yourself referring back to, yes, but there was this critical thing that they missed in the second week, and it's now week 6, and I'm just having difficulty letting that go because I've remembered that happened. So it's important always to recognise our biases, and therefore how we might influence the quality of feedback. The context also will influence the way in which we deliver feedback. So if you can consider, you might be one of 2 educators, or you might have 2 or 3 or 4 students with you. You might have 1 student with you, You might be very, very busy and have multiple competing factors that take you away from being able to provide feedback as timely as you would like to, or as extensively as you would like to. And these are all real features. So I'm not saying that we need to provide feedback in a particular way, but we need to recognise that the quality of our feedback will be affected by the context in which we're in, from a educators and a learner's perspective, and the contributing factors that may ensue from those. So it's important that we are able to support learners to develop the skills to shift the balance of responsibility. We want to ensure that the students have that learner-centred approach, and that always we consider some of those contributing factors to the quality of the feedback that might be provided. If you look at another school of thought, so different literature suggests that the learning culture influences the quality of the experience and thus the feedback that is provided. So I think we would align with that certainly whether we can probably identify clearly that if there is no culture or a poor culture for learning, that feedback may not be effective, quality might not be targeted, and therefore it's important that we consider the learning culture that we have within our interaction, within our clinical areas, within our department and within our organisation. Setting up the learning culture from the beginning is something that we can do. We can define expectations for the learner and the teacher relationships. So it's important here, the critical word here is trust. When we establish a relationship of trust between the learner and the educator, the learner is more likely to risk making mistakes, or asking questions, or exposing their vulnerabilities. And that's an important part of the learning gap, if you like, where the educator is able to identify more clearly some of the aspects of that particular student that allows the feedback to be delivered more targeted for them. The other suggestion is that we set up from the beginning the norms for feedback. So by saying that, we talk about feedback, how it's going to happen, what it looks like, what's expected with it, the dynamic nature of it, the relationship that ensues from it, etc. So that from the very beginning, the student is aware of feedback as a norm. So it's not something to be feared, it's not something that just happens at the midway point of the placement and the end of the placement, that it's, or perhaps even at the end of the day, but that throughout their entire interaction, there are opportunities for the learner to be at the centre of their feedback and influence their own learning outcomes. And that it's not a one-way, yes, we'll have feedback at these designated times, but there are other opportunities and other expectations around the norms of feedback. It's also important to direct attention to the dimensions of performance. So defining clear performance goals that align with the expectations, with feedback, and with the outcomes is critical to achieving success. So you can give students feedback, but if it's not aligned to the learning outcome or to the task at hand, it's probably going to be ineffective. So it's really important that at the beginning and setting up the culture that you match, if you like, expectations around the learning outcomes, and that feedback is inserted and explored along that direction towards the learning outcome. So it's also worthy of noting that it's not sufficient just to give good feedback. So learning culture doesn't mean that you're going to get good feedback, but creating a good learning culture allows the opportunity and the conditions for quality feedback to occur. So as we talked about, it allows that interaction the learner to respond and to direct and to be at the centre, driving their own learning outcomes. So it's worthy of spending time on reflecting on your own learning environment before students arrive and looking at the culture that you have and the way in which you can promote that throughout the placement with your students. Okay, if we look at the delivery, so in suggesting there are influences on quality feedback, then the delivery has to be one of those. We've talked a little bit about the interactional process, and in doing so, what we really want to do is promote a dialogue. So monologues and feedback are something that, you know, with the best of intentions, can often result where you might ask a student the initial question, how did you think that went, is a common question I hear from educators. And the student might give one or two answers. Say, yeah, that was okay, I did that all right, or you know, work on this, and that's it. And then what follows can be quite a verbose direction from the educator that says, yes, I agree, this was an issue, could have done that, we'll work on that. And a lot of information content can be directed at the student under the guise of, well, I did ask them and I did engage with them, but actually the balance has been tipped more towards the monologue than the dialogue. So again, it's important that we understand and we stop and we think and we engage and we ask reflective questions, and in essence we demand that the student is active in this process as we are interacting with them. It's important also that we individualise feedback to the learner's level. I talked about that, and we also have in other workshops that Schooling Up and Rehab Sciences delivers, or perhaps other workshops that you've attended, understand the importance of the individual learner influences through their learning preferences, their academic ability, their cultural background, and how to target feedback that might come to them and be a bit more individualised. So it's important that we consider that, but also the level at which the learner is. So not all learners, even though they all might be final year students, will perform at the same rate. And so a trick for us is to be able to recognise that and in some way be able to adapt what we do, or what might be better is to add some skills to our repertoire that engage the learner in a bit more of a reflective and self-directed process, so that we are not having to do too much more and adapting too much, but that we have some questions that might be around the issue of sorry, I just got distracted by a question that came in there, so I'll just start that again. But it's important that we have some additional things in our repertoire that we can help the student to be a bit more active. So questions such that are more reflective in nature. So ask the student to consider, what is it that you could do at this point in time? Where do you think your challenges lie at this moment in time? How can I help you with your progress here? Could be questions that you might ask them that are easy to add in, that allow the student to consider what their individual needs are. It's also important in delivering quality feedback that you maintain the balance between positive and constructive or corrective feedback, is another term that I've heard used. We know that students, particularly high achieving students, have their own inner critic and their own inner standards as their biggest driver. And so when feedback is given that's of a corrective nature or negative, the emphasis from the student's perception might magnify that. And to all of our intentions, it's our role to correct skills. And yes, it is our role to correct skills. Students might be a little bit more highly tuned to the negative, and therefore miss the positive altogether. So it's important that we facilitate some acknowledgement of positive feedback that has been given to the learner. It's also important to provide a balance of feedback that is addressing the specific concerns. So what needs to improve? And where I said earlier about how we can get caught up in giving the large verbose kind of account of everything that's possibly needs to improve. Particularly, we see this sometimes when we're giving midway feedback, or we're answering and providing 2 or 3 points to every criteria in the assessment form. Whilst that's really great reading down the track, it actually can have an effect of overwhelming the student to a point of they don't know where to go. They become lost in what is a multitude of things to work on. So it's really important that the balance there is tailored towards what are the key things that need to change here in your performance as you're moving forward. It's always important to relate to observed behaviour and not what you think might happen. So the other difficulty that I sometimes see with educators is that, and there might also be a little bit of a bias in here, is that educator will see something that might have happened earlier in the placement, may not have clearly had the opportunity to replicate that particular example, and therefore worries about what might occur in the future. What we will say is that we can only provide feedback to a student on what you've observed or what you've gathered sufficient evidence on to support the judgments. So, you can't wonder what ifs and what might be's. If you're not sure, you need to set up the opportunity for that student to demonstrate the skills that are required, and then you make a judgment that's either yes or no. They've done that or they've not done it, and then you provide them with that feedback. And limit the amount. I think I've already talked about that. So focus only on key points. Another model of quality feedback that might be something you can take away with is the prompted response. So these authors looked at, just as a tip for, if you're trying to remember how to give particulars of feedback, this is quite a well-rounded one. So pace for precise, attention to specifics, we talked about that. Relevance, hours for relevant to practice. Goals for outcome-based learners with clear aims. So this is kind of bringing together a lot of things I've already said. Measurable where improvements can be assessed. So I haven't talked about outcome measures or measuring the success of the change in performance resulting from the feedback, but that's certainly important in overall attainment of learning outcomes. B's for possible and attainable. So again, don't focus on the things that are not achievable. T is for time determined. Again, that relates to SMART goals and this type of feedback that you would give it a time component and a time boundary. E for encouraging and constructive feedback. So, I talked about the balance of corrective and positive feedback. So constructive feedback is really something that enables the student to do something with, bring about a change, and D is for descriptive. So that might be useful for you in using going forward. So I've talked a little bit about the learning, the stage of the learner. So again, in recognition that not all learners are at the same level, we need to consider how we make those adjustments to the student or the students. So if we think about a successful learner, they are usually someone who has insight into their own challenges, limitations. They generally understand what needs to be done and what the learning process looks like. And they can, with some help, but generally not too much help, explore the pathways for improvement, making connections as they go. They also, so what we can do is be quite specific with the learner there, where we can focus on, they can focus on the process, and we can help them just with minimal input, being specific about the areas and the direction that we want them to go in. What can be difficult with this particular type of learner is that they will engage in conversation about a topic. So they're often happy to explore the concepts that contribute to that topic. So, these are the learners that you can work with, and you can have a good dialogue. The process can be done. If you try to do the same type of situation with a learner who's struggling or who is not as advanced, then the interaction looks a whole lot different. With the successful learner, just another point, it's really important that you provide them with support and feedback, however, and opportunities to grow. Very often when we have a student who's going well, a learner who's successful and who's achieving the outcomes easily or more easily, we can sit back and let them go ahead. They can do some of our work for us, they can add value to our service. It's still really important that we engage in the process of feedback to help them learn and create them opportunities. So that in itself can be a bit of a challenge, and is another topic altogether. I could do another workshop on that. If we look at a struggling learner though, this is someone who needs more guidance because their insight is probably a lot less. They're often not reflective learners. They don't understand some of the gaps and some of the dots that need to be connected in the process. And it's important that we can chunk the learning up for them. So scaffolding the learning allows us to break it up into chunks. Also, a good way of bridging some of those gaps that are identified is to draw on their own experiences. So self-referencing what they've done before, allowing them to look at, oh yes, I did this before and it worked. Therefore, as an educator, you can create an opportunity for that learner to replicate what worked in the past in this new context. It's also important though to check for understanding, because not always is it clear to the educator that the student is actually keeping up. So that would be another tip when working with a learner who is struggling. Always check in along the way for their understanding, and that helps you to create the dialogue and to maybe backtrack a little bit if we've gone ahead too far, if you've thought that you've given them some information and that they should have understood that and progressed that, but giving you some signals of that nature, but actually the skills are not changing, then it's good to go back to just look at the gaps that might be there and identify some of those sort of different means to plug those gaps. Looking at feedback as well, the delivery of feedback, just a word on the order. So some, you would have heard of the feedback sign. Some people think that it's important to start with some positive, put the negative in the middle, and then finish again with some positive. So whilst that's a good way forward, often it can mean that the student just hears the first and the last thing that you said and missing some stuff in the middle. Or what it might do also is the educator who might be concerned a little bit about giving negative feedback because it's a bit more of an uncomfortable process might really emphasise the positives in the beginning and the end and not stay too long on the negatives in the middle. So the emphasis on the feedback that the student hears is much more in the positive domain. So there's a little bit of, inconsistency in the literature for the support for feedback signage. So Angela has presented another model which looks at a little bit more of a construct. So we start with some good news. What is done well? So what are the things that we've observed today by this interaction, and what can we identify has been done well? Then we bring in the counter to that is what are the things that need to improve. So we hold these two sets of feedback as separate. So identify what's good, identify what needs to improve, and then we look at, okay, options. Where do we go from here? So what kind of things can be done to change the things that need to improve? What options do I have on the table? It might involve redesigning a similar experience. It might involve going away and reading up on the background knowledge that's necessary to proceed. It might necessitate some reflective practice exercises, or it might be something that is about observing or remodeling the skill sets required. So identifying what options are available at that point in time is important. Then out of those options, engaging the learner to ask, what would you intend to do with these options to address the things that need to address? So again, it's supporting the dynamic engagement with the learner. It's putting them at the centre of it, and it's shifting the balance of the responsibility to them to develop. What would you like to do here with these options? Here are the things we've got at our disposal. What do you think would work for you? And then at the end of it, okay, I've identified some things and we're both committed to going forward with that. And that's where you put the time reference section to that. So it might be for today, it might be for the rest of the week, or it might indeed, if you've got a longer placement opportunity, it might be for the next couple of weeks, and then we revisit it. So this is quite a good plan in terms of how you actually approach the process and the delivery of feedback. So the last domain in this one is effective feedback. Much of this we've probably talked about in a roundabout way, but looking at feedback as being facilitative rather than directive enhances learning. This video and again supports the interactional component I've talked about and the dynamic part of that also. Feedback can be interpreted differently, and it's important to recognise that how the student interprets and deals with the feedback is critical to the success of that transformation. So if the student has got a faulty interpretation of that and doesn't actually know what to do with it, then they won't improve. That's essentially what that says. We also know that negative feedback can evoke strong emotional reactions which might interfere with its acceptance and its use. So I mentioned before about students with very high standards can have a tendency to focus on the critical and the negative. In some instances, that can be really disabling for a student, where all they've heard is that they need to do something better, and this in itself is an issue. Now, I'm not expecting that perhaps educators have to deal with that, but it's important that they recognise that's a potential impact on the way in which student will receive that. So if you feel or you see signs of a student not coping or being really hard on themselves, it might be worth anchoring back to the feedback that you had given. Is there anything in the feedback that I've given you that has evoked this response? Could be a starting point. And that way you can discuss with them a more relative emphasis for where the intended feedback lay. So just like I said above, feedback is at its most powerful when it addresses faulty interpretations. So students will have some understanding. What they don't have is necessarily the correct interpretation of how that understanding fits when it comes to clinical practice and skill development. So it's important that we look at their interpretation. So start with what they know and what they're bringing to it, and then see if that interpretation is being misunderstood or misinterpreted along the way. Because if you can correct the faulty interpretations, then the feedback is very targeted, and you'll probably see a much better outcome and transformation within the students' progress. Feedback also must be conceptualised as a supported sequential process rather than a series of unrelated events. And that's linked back to when I said that feedback needs to be aligned with the learning outcomes and the context of the learning that the student's there to do. So as more experienced clinicians in our domain, we can go off on tangents about, you know, how this practice is really good and that practice is good, and here's much more quality engagement with the clients, and you know, before you know it, you start to be looking at more postgraduate experience, which is where you're sitting, where you're passionate about, and you're trying to convey your experience to a learner who's really not at that level yet. So it's important for you to strip that back a little bit, understand the context of their learning, and align the feedback along the path of their progress towards that learning. Okay, we also know that effective feedback from a student's perspective is quite complex. They report it to be quite complex and multidimensional, so they recognise the contributing factors that an educator must face when providing feedback to them. From a student's perspective, information that closes the gap, i.e. tells them how to improve, is something that they value. They want constructive feedback, so not just positive, but constructive, something that they can do something with. Again, links to the how to improve point above. They need to understand it, so it's got to be clear. They don't like ambiguous feedback at all. So it's important that we clarify with the student, have they understood the intent of this and why it's important that they proceed with whatever statement we are providing or direction we are supporting the student to go. They value, and from their perspective, feedback must be fair and it must be transparent. And sometimes this links to the credibility of the source, i.e. the CE. So if they don't believe that the CE is fair, is authentic in their delivery of feedback, or has the experience to determine and direct them, then they will see that CE as an incredible source, and therefore they won't necessarily adopt the feedback. So as educators, it's important for us to be fair and transparent, and to share our story a little bit to let the students know that we are authentic in our intentions and that we do have knowledge and credibility in the information that we are providing for them. Students also recognise the impact factor. They ask that you allow them time to adjust. So again, this relates to sometimes when you might have given some feedback directly after a patient, and then you might expect that on the next patient, which is either immediately or after lunch or sometimes later that day, that the student adopt the feedback immediately and bring about a change. And so if it doesn't quite happen the way you think it is, then you see two undesirable performances in the same day, and you think, well, we already spoke about that and you had a chance to change that. Students might report that they need more time and therefore perhaps several opportunities to change and for it to make sense for them. I've talked about the negative feelings of feedback as being devastating. So in summary, effective feedback produces effective learning, and this is for all of the regions discussed thus far. Just a word on closing the gap. I just realised that I've gone over time a little bit, but I'll keep going. So there's two things that can happen here when the student perceives that the gap is too big. So they will either increase the effort to close the gap, or they will abandon and reduce the goal. So they will make the goal closer or less effective. So it's important for us to understand that that's, I guess, two particular ways it can go, so as that we are able to support and facilitate appropriate strategies for in closing the gap. Again, comes into starting with what's understood and what's known, looking at actual performance versus where performance needs to be. Hattie and Timberley have got a really good effective feedback model, and although it's a little bit complex on the screen, just like to draw your attention to the effective feedback. It generally looks at answering these three questions: where am I going, how am I going, and where do I need to go to next? They've coined this in terms of feed up, feedback, and feed forward. So feeding up, where am I going at this particular moment? This model that they describe applies these three questions to all four tasks, all four levels of the learning activity. So at the task, process, self-regulation, and self-actualization levels. So that's a little bit more scholarly, but just in terms of looking at being able to identify with the student, here's where I'm going, here's how I'm going, and here's where I need to go to next, can be really good ways of providing effective feedback. Okay, quickly, before we run out of time, just to talk a little bit about challenging feedback and when there's an elephant in the room. So this can often be the educators report as the most difficult feedback to give, when it appears to be more focused towards a personal attribute of a learner rather than task, skill, or an objective skill set that you can identify and anchor to the assessment. So some of those examples might be the hygiene, might be mannerisms or fidgeting, might be non-verbals that they see, constant yawning, it might be a nervous laugh, it might be always looking around the room, not maintaining eye contact, intrusion on personal space, all of these types of things. So it's important to remember the human factor, that these are, your learners are people and you're a person. And, often it can be sensitive to raise some of these personal attributes, and you should approach it human person to human person. Respectfully, privately, one-on-one, familiar and comfortable, so that you really do pay attention to the environment we're in. Use non-judgmental, neutral language. Emphasize the impact of the issue that you're dealing with respect to clients and in a professional context. Keep it simple and honest. Allow students space and time to express their feelings. So they might get angry, they might cry, they might just shut down. It's important that you allow that space to occur and then work with that. Acknowledge both the non-verbal and the verbal, respond with empathy, and look to the potential contributing factors so that you're not misinterpreting what it is that you're seeing. There's a good little article which anyone wanted can pass on to you, or the reference is actually in the back of these slides, Schoolfield. And it's just an editorial brief grab, but it's about a student who smells. How do you tell a student who smells that they smell? And so it really goes into, it explores, well, we can outsource it, we can send them an email, it comes from an anonymous source that says, you should buy deodorant. How impersonal is something like that? It goes through all the, a few scenarios and runs basically at these tips that we have in front of you for now to remember that they are a human person and we should address it. Okay, so just leave you with a summary. Helps to clarify what good performance is relative to the expected standards. Good feedback facilitates the development of reflection and self-assessment, delivers high quality information to students about their learning, but engages in a dynamic and dialogue around that learning. Encourages positive motivational beliefs and self-esteem, so self-regulation, and provides opportunities to close the gap between current and desired performance. Also provides information to educators that can be used to help shape the education, so taking that information from the context. And that's it. So I haven't received very many questions coming through. We will run out of time for the questions. I am happy to take email questions if my email address is r.moody@uq.edu.au, and you'll find me more details about me in physiotherapy if you want to search for my contact details there. So before we go, I'd like to just share. So let's bring up the 4. And ask you to complete just 5 questions at the end, if you wouldn't mind, before you log off. Thank you very much for your time, and hopefully this has been beneficial to you in your practice. Thank you.